Recently, articles and videos have started appearing about how the US and allies will arrange a naval blockade of China in case of war with Taiwan and so on. I also recalled a number of articles that talked about blockade of Russia's maritime communications, such as this one from March 17, 2022. Headlined, "On the Threshold of a Naval Blockade, the US Threatens Russia with the Use of Force." Here's an excerpt from it. In an interview with CNBC, U.S. Undersecretary of Finance Wally Adamus said the Americans are still considering a full trade embargo and blocking Russia's access to international waterways. End of stats. In general, there was a whole series of publications after the start of the operation about the terrible blockades of Russia's sea routes, and the result? And the result is nothing. Moreover, there are several rogue states that God himself told us to blockade by sea. Moreover, the US has all the forces for this, such as Iran or North Korea. And yet their ships crawl the world's oceans unchallenged. And if the British and an Iranian vessel are arrested, for example, there is a painful retaliation. And nothing, no blockade. The US only arrested the North Korean vessel within its 15-mile zone. No blockade of sea lanes. That's kind of weird. There are continuous threats to block sea lanes, and the result is nothing. No blockades of routes, mass seizure of sea vessels, and so on. Although there are opportunities to do so, there's probably some fundamental reason why the US and Britain can't do it. It is ridiculous to believe in the goodwill of these countries. Usually in articles on this topic it is customary to categorically assert certain theses, to pound them into the readers' heads. Further, our thoughts, which are not the truth in the last instance. We're going to reason, and you follow the chain of argument. Maybe we're wrong. C. The island and maritime empires, the UK and to some extent the US have huge navies with airstrike groups, naval bases, vassals around the world. We are used to seeing hypertrophied, bloated navies as the undoubted strength of maritime empires. But every strength almost always arises as a response to a weakness. The maritime supply routes of the island powers are vital to their security. The main objective of the Russian Federation is to ensure that it is included in the world trade and economic relations, and even for the simple functioning of its domestic economy. That's something I hope no one will argue with. If for us, as a mainland empire, the blockade of maritime trade routes is very unpleasant, with a 10 to 20% drop in GDP, with economic crisis and social problems, but in principle it is clear that on the horizon of a couple of decades we will rebuild logistics, lay railroads and ordinary roads, lay pipelines, and everything will return to normal. Then for an island empire to blockade the sea lanes is a total disaster. With the destruction of the domestic economy, with starvation and extinction, and the complete end of the state in the country. That is their main weakness. Huge fleets are a response to this weakness, a desire to cover it up. England was at war with Spain on the seas because there was no way out. If Spain had beaten England, and out of England would have come the kind of Iceland on the back of the world. But England won and became an empire. And now all the finances and economy of England, and afterward of the United States, are tied to maritime trade. A lot of people use the term petrodollar. This may have been correct at the beginning of trading for oil in dollars, but it doesn't reflect the full picture now. Any commodity that trades in dollars ensures its viability. The maritime powers receive insurance payments from all ships, receive interest on the loans with which the ships were bought, dividends from the shares of the ship companies. Commodities are traded on the London and New York exchanges, where money is withdrawn from each transaction to the Wall Street gatekeepers. That is, all the world's trade by sea generates huge amounts of money for the maritime powers. Their entire economy is linked to the sea and sea routes of trade. In addition, the sea allows maritime powers to project their power to different parts of the world. Now why is it impossible to blockade at sea not even Russia or China, but virtually any state? The risks are not commensurate with the rewards. Remember the uproar when a mine from one of our neighboring countries in the 50s and 60s was thrown off its anchor and dumped into the Bosphorus? The fact is that any ship is a very expensive object. To minimize risks, they are insured. I don't know the exact insurance contracts, but if I were the insurer, I would write that the insurance does not cover the vessel's movement in areas where there is a mine hazard, sort of at your own risk. Now imagine that the mines are not from the 50s, 60s, but modern and smart. Scattered in a semicircle around major British or US ports that surface at random times and start moving to search for merchant ships, which can receive targeting instructions by satellite or via radio. That can recognize targets by mass and so on and so forth. You can even do without onyxes and basalt, calibers and Iskanders. A few submarines, as the Americans call them, black hole, I think will do quite well. It's a completely asymmetrical approach, just the way we like it. For warships it would probably pose little danger, but for a goods ship it's death. Every escort of merchant ship caravans would turn into a costly World War II-type military operation with corresponding casualties. Any merchant ships will shy away from such places like the devil from frankincense. World trade with the island empires would just go up in smoke. And what does this have to do with Russia's naval blockade? We think that after the first statements of US officials about the naval blockade of Russia, our counter steps in this direction were conveyed to these officials in an extremely simple and understandable form. We'll go to heaven and you'll just die. And after that we never heard such statements again. The same applies to the naval blockade of Kaliningrad. It can't be anything like that. Because this is war. Maybe not even nuclear, but trade and economic, torpedo and mine. But the consequences for the islands will be no less devastating. Even if a conventional war breaks out between NATO and Russia, sea routes of communication are the last thing to be blocked. Because it's the death of the US and England. And the world economy to boot. So any experts can say what they want about naval blockades, about cutting us off from Kaliningrad, and so on. Except, well, at least we think so, there's no way the US has the capacity for such action.